editing a scene and putting it together, it's quite a process, because the most important element to that, I think, is knowing your footage. Really getting to know what shots you've got and what to pull from. Really knowing the performances. Myself as a director, I like to watch the footage over and over and over. I'm not necessarily going to edit the movie, but I'll familiarize myself with the footage and know those shots that I love, where I feel like I know on set I had a performance. So I'll make a mental note of those shots so that when the editor's putting it together and I see the rough cut, I want to make sure that those get in there. Now we may not be able to use those because it may not cut together and it may not work, but at least as a director I've gone through, looked at the footage and gotten to know the footage and know the shots that I personally feel like the performances are great in.
The first stage when you're cutting is to make an assembly. You take all the footage and you just put it together. It's almost always really long and really boring, and it doesn't feel like a movie, but it's just all the scenes strung out in a row the way they are in the script. Then you start refining that, and after a couple weeks you'll have something that kind of starts to feel like a movie. That's generally what you'd call a rough cut. From there you keep cutting and you keep refining it until you get to what's called a fine cut, and that really feels like a movie, but it still has some kinks.
What now? We do it all over again?
Yeah. Except this time it's for real.
You keep cutting that, and then you lock what's called locking your picture, which means that you're not going to cut anymore and you're done. That's the fourth stage.
So, you like to hunt?
Biggest pitfalls, I think, for a beginning editor are paying too much attention to continuity, which is always a battle I still fight as well. You want it to cut invisibly, but it's really, you gotta always remember that the acting and the story have to come first. I think a lot of novice editors have a hard time knowing, especially in a dialogue scene, when and why to cut. And the biggest pitfall that you can run into as a novice is inexperience. And unfortunately, the only way to avoid that pitfall is to get more experience. If you're going into editing as a novice, just remember, keep trying over and over again. It's like writing, you gotta rewrite. And editing is all about rewriting. It's really just revision after revision after revision. And trying not to get frustrated with that process, because it can be frustrating. But you just have to really believe that it's the best path to follow, because it is. Generally, you're going on, starting with what is the intention of the scene. That's got to be paramount to everything. Acting, which parts of which takes you have that are the best acting. And then way down the list, there's also continuity, which you have to account for. There are cut points, they are called, where it is more likely that no one will notice the cut if you cut at those points. So you have to be aware of those as well. Generally, that'll be like a movement.
They weren't supposed to print that for another week.
For instance, if you were cutting from me in this kind of medium, and I turn and turn back, and you want to cut from a wide to a close-up, you're probably going to cut on the turn, on the movement, because the eye is distracted, and you won't notice the cut as much. So that kind of thing is also, you have to take into account. But really what you're looking for, if it's a drama, for instance, you're looking for the way that you're going to juice out the most amount of drama out of the scene. Or if it's a comedy, you're going to be looking for the way to make it the funniest. And that is always paramount. In Big Game, I worked really closely with Chet. I knew we talked a lot before we started cutting about what he wanted, so I knew what direction he wanted to go in. Then later on, when we had an assembly of the movie, Chet would sit with me and we'd go through, and we went through a number of drafts of the movie. This movie is, while it's short, it's very complicated. It was important that we gave just the right amount of information at the right time. So Chet and I had to work very carefully to achieve that. The script and the director really determine the style. And the way that everything shook up during production. That's the whole battle in all aspects of filmmaking, is taking the initial idea and then fighting off all of the forces that try to break it down and leave you with not that thing at the end. There's kind of two modes that this movie works in, but I think that they work in conjunction really well. One is kind of the past. We see the past in more of this kind of languid, soft lighting. There's scenes, for instance, we start above them when Josh and Fahim are in Fahim's house and they're discussing their plan. Whenever we're in the past, we tend to cut slower. The shots were designed that way. And in the near past, there's much more of an urgency. For instance, in the interrogation room with the interrogator and Josh, we're cutting much more often. We're using much harder cuts, for instance, to mirror the action that's going on in there, because while he is still, and the camera is generally still, the cuts are often hard like a punch. If a scene is dragging or feels slow, there are a couple of possibilities. It might actually not even be the scene that feels slow. It could be that what's taken you so long to get there feels slow, and to a lesser degree what comes after it, but that can affect it as well. There might just be too many pauses. You might just be holding on things too long. You might have come into the scene too early, but it may be that you need to come in more in the middle of the action, which is generally, you get in the middle and you get out in the middle. You get the nugget of information that's necessary to move the story forward, and you're out. And generally, if a scene is feeling slow and you're sure that it's not what's coming before it, then it's something that's in the scene that is just taking too long to get the information, or we're staying too long after we get the information.
Nice.
You alright?
Yeah, just a little rusty at this, that's all.
Well, don't worry, it'll all come back to you.
We have a scene in Big Game that started out very long, had a lot of exposition in it, and was just every cut of the movie, it just dragged. There were a lot of points in the dialogue that we needed to cover, however, it just was dragging and dragging and dragging. So eventually we just had to face the facts and cut some of it out. Creating tension is really about what you tell the audience and when you tell it. Surprise is easy. And horror movies are the easiest example of that is, you have somebody sitting in a car and suddenly there's someone in the back seat, surprise. If you know that person's in the back seat for a long time before they pop up, then that's suspense. Letting the audience in a little bit early and then drawing them with that knowledge and dropping a little bit here, a little bit there. They're getting tense because they know something is going to happen that generally the characters don't. There is this notion that bin Laden has been shot. We know he's been shot. So when, towards the end of the film, when we're seeing Josh bring his scope up, we know he's just about to pull the trigger. We're waiting for him to pull the trigger. The quick cutting between bin Laden and his goons and Josh and his scope add to that sense. We keep going back and forth. Which cut is it going to be on that he finally pulls it? Is it going to be now? No. Is it going to be now? No. We know something's coming, but we have to wait. We're told to wait. And suspense, the very word implies waiting. You're suspending something. You've told them something, and now you're suspending the payoff until that final moment where you relieve the tension, and then you start building it up.
What good is it now?
You know when you're done when it feels right, when there's nothing you can think of that you'd want to change. And that takes a long time, and it is difficult to know that that's for sure. I mean, I always say, like, the last 5% is bigger than the first 95%. You take a bunch of footage, you cut an assembly of the whole movie. It maybe takes you 3 weeks. To cut that down to the final movie, which, the changes become almost imperceptible to most people, could take another 3 months. But, generally, okay, we got it finally. There's nothing that we want to change anymore. We watch the whole movie start to finish, and there's no changes. Then you're done.